On May 28, 2000, an 18-year-old woman named Devin Guzman stood on a beach on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. She squinted her eyes from the sunlight as a tropical breeze blew lightly through her shoulder-length hair. Standing facing her was her girlfriend, Michelle Hetzel, who was also 18 and who was holding a pair of gold and diamond rings in her hand. Devin almost began to tear up as Michelle slipped one of the rings onto her ring finger. And then Devin reached out and did the same, placing the other ring on Michelle's ring finger. Then the young women held hands and recited vows to each other. Now, there was no priest or marriage officiant present, but for Devin, it didn't matter. She was spiritually and emotionally pledging to spend the rest of her life with Michelle. And in this moment, she couldn't imagine she could ever be happier. Their private little makeshift wedding ceremony during their Memorial Day weekend vacation almost felt like a fantasy. St. Croix was hundreds of miles away from Northampton County in Pennsylvania, where Michelle and Devin both lived. Michelle lived in a city called Easton, and Devin lived nearby in Forks Township. But life had been full of exciting changes recently for Devin. In the last 4 months, she'd moved out of her mom's house, gotten her own car, and started a full-time job as a cleaning technician for a company that repaired and restored property damage. And now, getting married to the woman she loved on a beach in the Caribbean felt like a romantic and fitting way to end a whirlwind couple of months. Now, Devin took Michelle's hand, and the two walked through the warm sand to a tourist trap bar to celebrate with some cold drinks. However, after they got a table, and the afterglow of exchanging vows began to fade along with the late afternoon sun, reality began to set in for Devin. Getting married to Michelle in a tropical paradise was one thing, but dealing with the repercussions back home from this marriage was going to be something else entirely. It wasn't homophobia that she was worried about. In 2000, there was still some social stigma associated with being a member of the LGBTQ community, but Devin was confident and outspoken, and so this didn't bother her. What Devin was worried about, though, was the very complicated romantic situation that was waiting for her back home. Because despite the fact that Devin had just gotten, spiritually married to Michelle here on this beach, she was actually already living with her other girlfriend, whose name was Carrie Renner. And that wasn't all. Her other girlfriend, Carrie, was actually also married to someone else, a man. Although Carrie and her husband had actually been separated since he had left for the army to go to basic training. But Devin's relationship with Carrie was a lot different than her relationship with her new spiritual wife, Michelle. Devin and Carrie fought a lot, and their fights often became physical. Sometimes the police would have to come to break them up. Devin looked down at the pager clipped to her waist, and she was actually a little surprised that Carrie had not been paging her nonstop. Devin was planning to break up with Carrie as soon as she got home, and she really was not looking forward to the fight that would almost certainly cause. But she decided that, for right now, she wasn't going to think about any of that. Instead, she looked up and clinked her glass against Michelle's, then took a sip of her cocktail. Later that night, Devin and Michelle were relaxing back in their hotel room. They were preparing to head back home the next day, and they were both sad and kind of stressed that their trip was almost over. Because going back home wasn't only going to be complicated for Devin. Michelle also had a difficult set of relationships waiting for her back in Pennsylvania. Just like Devin, Michelle was also married to someone else, a man named Brandon Bloss. Michelle had actually used Brandon's credit card to pay for this St. Croix trip. But, also just like Devin, Michelle was planning on breaking up with Brandon right when they got back home. However, Devin and Michelle had come up with a plan to make their transition into their new life of spiritual marriage together easier. And now, sitting on the hotel bed together, Devin put this plan into action. She picked up the hotel phone and called her father, Rick Guzman, who lived near her in Pennsylvania. When her dad answered, Devin told him about how she and Michelle had just gotten, spiritually married and that she was planning to break up with Carrie. And then she asked if she and Michelle could come move in with him for a bit. Rick immediately said yes, and Devin knew just from the sound of his voice that he was actually thrilled with her news, because he knew all too well that her relationship with Carrie was sort of a nightmare. So Devin thanked her dad and said she loved him very much and hung up. Then she and Michelle went to sleep feeling happy. A few weeks later, at around 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 14th, Devin and Michelle were hanging out and drinking at Devin's father's house in Pennsylvania, like they often did these days. However, Devin and Michelle were not actually living there yet, like they had planned to do way back in St. Croix. And this was because neither of them had actually broken up with their other partners yet, or had even told them about their spiritual wedding with each other. I mean, basically, they had kept everybody in the dark. And as this night wore on, and Devin and Michelle drank more and more, this fact started to become a point of contention between them, and they started to bicker. Both of them were mad at the other for not fully committing. And so a little after 9 p.m., Devin and Michelle each left the house feeling really mad, and they got into their own cars and they drove off to their own homes. A few minutes later, Devin stumbled drunkenly up the stairs and towards the door of the apartment that she still shared with Carrie that was right above a bar in Forks Township. She paused before she walked in. She was dreading the confrontation she knew was waiting for her inside. Devin looked down at the palm of her hand, at a cut that had not quite finished healing yet. Only weeks earlier, after she had come home from St. Croix, she had tried to tell Carrie she did want to break up, but before she could say very much, Carrie had threatened to kill herself with a knife. And then when Devin had tried to wrestle that knife out of her hands, Devin had gotten this big cut on her hand, which required a trip to the emergency room. And so eventually, Devin took a deep breath, then reached down and turned the doorknob and walked inside. As expected, Carrie was waiting, and she was very upset. Devin couldn't hide the fact that clearly she had been out drinking, and also she couldn't hide who she had been out drinking with. And so naturally they began to argue, and for the first time, Devin told Carrie that she and Michelle had exchanged wedding rings during their trip to St. Croix, and this made Carrie fly into a rage. And so she hit Devin, and Devin hit her right back. And then before it could turn into a full-blown physical altercation, Devin's pager suddenly went off. She picked it up and saw that Michelle had actually been paging her nonstop. She just hadn't noticed. And so quickly, she just walked away from Carrie and went into another room to call Michelle. And then a few minutes later, she just came back into the living room where Carrie was still standing there fuming. And Devin told Carrie that, hey, Michelle's not feeling well. And so I'm going to go over to her house and check on her. And Carrie was sort of caught off guard and just said, well, I'm going with you. And Devin, not wanting to argue anymore or have this escalate any further, told Carrie that fine, she could come as long as she stayed in the car the whole time. So at around 10:30 p.m., Devin pulled her car up to Michelle's house in Easton with Carrie sitting in the passenger seat. Devin reminded Carrie to remain where she was, and then Devin got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Devin knocked, and Michelle's husband, Brandon, answered. And unsurprisingly, he said he would not let Devin inside. However, the reason he gave was because his wife, Michelle, was upset that Devin had come here with Carrie. And so he told Devin that if you want to come inside, you first have to bring Carrie home. And so Devin just turned around, walked back to her car, got inside, and informed Carrie that she was going to have to drive her back home and that she really didn't want to fight about it. And surprisingly, Carrie just sort of agreed because she didn't want to fight either. And at around 11:30 p.m., Devin dropped her off back at the Forks Township apartment. Devin did go into the apartment with Carrie for a little while, but then at about 12:15 a.m., she went back outside and left to return to Michelle's place. About 30 minutes later, around 12:45 a.m. on that Friday morning, the phone at Devin and Carrie's apartment began to ring. Carrie answered and heard Michelle's voice on the other line. And Michelle sounded really upset. She was demanding to know where Devin was. Carrie told Michelle to slow down here. She said Devin wasn't home because she had gone to your place. And when Michelle heard that, her voice turned frantic. She told Carrie that Devin had not returned to her house that evening, and that she'd been paging Devin over and over again, but Devin still had not called her back. Now, to Carrie, this seemed like classic Devin behavior. Devin had a habit of storming off dramatically and disappearing for a while and not talking to anybody, but she always came back. And so Carrie tried to reassure Michelle that, Devin would turn up soon. However, trying to reassure Michelle only made Michelle mad. Michelle began accusing Carrie of lying and started insisting that Devin must be with Carrie right now, and that Carrie was selfishly keeping Devin from seeing her. Then, very abruptly, Carrie heard Michelle slam the receiver down to hang up the phone. Carrie thought that was going to be the end of it, but about an hour and a half later, at about 2:30 in the morning, there was a loud knock on her door. And when Carrie answered, she found herself face to face with Michelle. And just as Michelle had done over the phone, she once again began to aggressively accuse Carrie of literally hiding Devin in the apartment. But Carrie told Michelle she had nothing to hide. And to prove it, she let Michelle come in and look around for Devin. Carrie figured, once Michelle searched her apartment, she would chill out and realize Carrie was honestly telling the truth here. But Michelle did not chill out. Instead, after searching the apartment and not finding Devin, Michelle took out her phone and called 911. Hours later, still on that Friday morning, Carrie woke up in bed, where she'd finally collapsed after being awake most of the night. The cops had come to her place after Michelle called 911, but they seemed totally uninterested in the fact that Devin could be missing. And since it hadn't been 24 hours since she'd been seen or heard from, they really couldn't even file a missing persons report. Instead, the cops issued what's called an attempt to locate report, which as far as Carrie could tell was basically the same thing, but just way less urgent. And before Carrie could even begin to sort out all her thoughts, there was another knock on her door. And so Carrie got up and she opened it up, and once again there was Michelle. And she looked like she literally hadn't slept. And then she would say that, yep, she'd been up all night and all morning just calling Devin's pager over and over again and just not getting an answer. Carrie rubbed her eyes and told Michelle to please calm down, that she was just making herself crazy here. But Michelle ignored her and suggested they should both drive around together and see if they could literally just go find Devin, since it was obvious the cops were not going to be much help here. Carrie did not really want to go drive around with Michelle, but she figured, at the very least, it would get Michelle out of her apartment. So Carrie got dressed and got into Michelle's car, and the two of them drove around town, scouting all the usual places they would go to with Devin. But realistically, Carrie was barely paying attention. She thought the whole thing was a big waste of time and that Devin was sure to turn up soon on her own. That is, until around 1 p.m., when they arrived at a place called Canal Park, which was this gravel parking lot in Easton right next to a river. Because as they pulled into the lot, Carrie saw Devin's car, a silver Pontiac Sunfire with a rainbow sticker on the bumper. And so as soon as Michelle came to a stop, Carrie jumped out of the car and ran over to Devin's car and tried to open the door, but it was locked. She banged on the window in frustration and tried to look inside, but the windows were too tinted so she couldn't see anything. But then she remembered she actually had a spare key in her pocket. So she pulled it out, unlocked the door, opened it up, and when she did, she screamed. A half an hour later, Detective Barry Golozeski of the Easton Police Department stepped out of his cruiser at Canal Park. As he slipped under the yellow police tape that cordoned off the area, Golozeski mentally ran through what dispatch had told him. 2 women had discovered the body of their friend, another young woman named Devin Guzman. He looked over and saw 2 crying women in the park, and figured those must be the 2 women who found the body. Golozeski just shook his head. Easton was not the kind of place where you would expect to find a dead teenager in a parking lot. Nonetheless, he walked over to the car to get a look for himself, peering in through the open rear door. Devin's body was curled up on the back seat, facing the rear of the car and covered by a green jacket. He slipped on a pair of disposable gloves and went in for a closer look. He peeled back the jacket, and right away he saw a gaping wound on the front of Devin's neck. But he noticed right away that there was very little blood for such a major injury. And her clothes weren't covered in blood either, which is what he would have expected. Instead, he just saw dirt and grass stains. He scanned the interior of the car and saw that it too was pretty clean, although one of the floor mats was missing. But the strangest detail was what Devin had clenched in her hand. She was holding a kitchen knife. Something about this didn't sit right to Golozeski. The knife in Devin's hand seemed to suggest she might have cut her own throat, but slitting your throat was a horrible way to die. Besides, there was almost no blood, barely any in the car and none on the knife. So to Golozeski, he felt like this was not a suicide. This was a murder staged to look like a suicide. Just then, the coroner's car pulled into the gravel lot, signaling to the detective that it was time for him to get a move on. Golozeski grabbed a cop standing nearby and told him to have both Devin's car and the car her friends had been driving when they found her impounded immediately. Devin's car for obvious reasons, but the friend's car as well, because the women had driven it so close to the crime scene. Then Goloszewski walked over to the two hysterical friends of his victim and told them he would give them a ride to the police station to get their statements. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Goloszewski walked into an interview room at Easton Police Headquarters and sat down across from Carrie, who had been crying so much that her eyes were red and bloodshot and her voice was hoarse. Goloszewski started with the basics, asking Carrie how long she'd been friends with Devin. Now, in a homicide investigation, Goloszewski knew that everyone connected to the victim starts off as a suspect. But neither Carrie nor the other friend, Michelle, seemed particularly suspicious, at least to him so far. That was until Carrie started talking. Because right away, she explained to Goloszewski that she and Devin were not just friends. They were actually in a relationship together. Although she admitted she was also technically married to somebody else too. And Carrie didn't stop there. She told Goloszewski that Michelle, the other friend who had been there when they found the body, was also in a relationship with Devin. But like Carrie, Michelle was also married to someone else, another man, and she was living with him. Goloszewski could barely keep this straight, but he also just couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the first 5 minutes of his interview, he already had a list of 4 people: Carrie, her husband, Michelle, and Michelle's husband, who were all romantically linked to the victim. The potential for jealous rivalries here was through the roof, and so they were definitely all suspects. And so they were all going to need an alibi. So Goloszewski told Carrie to slow down and asked her about the last time she had seen Devin. Carrie took a deep, calming breath. Then she said that she and Devin had been fighting recently because Carrie was really upset about Devin's ongoing relationship with Michelle. She said that Michelle and Devin had recently gone to St. Croix together, and it just really upset Carrie. Goloszewski nodded, but inside he was thinking this is sort of like textbook jealous rivalry here. However, Carrie went on to say that their most recent fight had not been as bad as some of their other fights. She admitted that on other occasions when they got into fights, that she and Devin would get physical. But most recently, she said their fight had just been them yelling at each other. And then, after this heated argument, Carrie said she had actually gone with Devin to Michelle's house, where Michelle's husband had told Devin to take Carrie back home again. And so Carrie said Devin came back to the car and did drive her back to the apartment, and she got dropped off at about 11:30 p.m., and then Devin left again a little while later to presumably go back to Michelle's. But apparently she hadn't made it there, because Michelle had called, asking Carrie, where is Devin? And she said, I thought she was with you. When Carrie finished, Goloszewski just sat there, trying to make sense of this very complicated story she had just told him. Of all the romantic partners in Devin's life, it seemed to Goloszewski that Carrie was, physically at least, the closest to her, given that they lived together. And so that put her pretty high up on the suspect list. But on the other hand, she was being extremely candid about the ugly side of their relationship, which made him think, she might not be trying to hide anything. After Goloszewski wrapped up the interview, he told Carrie she could go. Then Goloszewski walked out of the room, wondering what more his victim's other girlfriend could possibly have to say. But when Goloszewski sat down to speak with Michelle, Devin's other girlfriend, the other friend who found the body, he immediately sensed that this was going to be a very different kind of interview. Carrie had been almost shockingly honest, but Michelle seemed far less interested in talking much at all about her personal life. She downplayed her relationship with Devin, saying that while they had been romantically involved in high school, they were just friends now. So typically, a person lying about their romantic affiliation with a murder victim was a huge red flag for Goloszewski. But this case was a bit different. In the year 2000, being gay or bisexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so it was actually more surprising to Goloszewski that Carrie had been so open about it than it was that Michelle was sort of trying to downplay it. And so he didn't press Michelle too hard on her romantic relationship with Devin. And besides, Michelle seemed to have a lot to say about Carrie. Michelle told Goloszewski that when Devin did not return to her house after dropping off Carrie on the night she disappeared, Michelle called Carrie to find out where Devin was. But Carrie had sounded totally unconcerned. And then, when Michelle had literally gone to Carrie's house to look for Devin, she said the only reaction Carrie had about the whole situation was just irritation. Michelle said she had been the one to insist on calling 911, like we don't know where Devin is, we have to do something. But then when the police showed up, they didn't really take it seriously, which was upsetting, But what was even more upsetting was apparently Carrie's reaction to all this. Michelle told Goloszewski that Carrie basically didn't care and had even tried to talk Michelle out of calling the police in the first place, like she just didn't seem to care about Devin. After that, Michelle asked Goloszewski if Carrie had told him about the fight where Carrie had stabbed Devin in the hand. And Goloszewski just shook his head and said no. And so she told Goloszewski everything Devin had told her about that particular incident. And then at the end of telling the story, she told the detective that really that ordeal kind of summed up Devin and Carrie's relationship. And all of this did make Goloszewski more suspicious of Carrie, but then again, this whole four-way romantic relationship just generally seemed highly suspicious to Goloszewski. It was hard to try to sort out which of Devin's married girlfriends was lying about what and why. After wrapping up with Michelle, Goloszewski had just one more interview to conduct that afternoon, and that was actually speaking to Michelle's husband, Brandon Bloss. Some uniformed officers had gone to Michelle's house while Goloszewski was talking to Carrie and Michelle and brought Brandon in. And so after leaving Michelle, Goloszewski went to find Brandon. At this point, he didn't know what to expect. And for a second, when he entered the final interview room, he got excited, because Brandon was sitting there sweating profusely and looking incredibly uncomfortable. And Goloszewski's first thought was that, boy, he must be nervous. But then, Goloszewski took in what Brandon was actually wearing, which was a long-sleeve shirt and jeans in the middle of summer, inside of a tiny interview room with no windows and weak air conditioning. And so quickly, his excitement disappeared. Brandon was not nervous, he was just hot. The whole interview with Brandon turned out to be pretty unhelpful. He seemed to have no idea that his wife was romantically involved with Devin. And he also didn't know about their trip to St. Croix. In fact, he said that Michelle had told him that she'd gone on a business trip to San Francisco, not to a tropical island on vacation with Devin. Now, it was possible that Brandon could be pretending not to know anything about his wife's relationship with Devin, but given how tight-lipped Michelle herself had been with the detective, Goloszewski was inclined to think that Brandon might really be in the dark here. Eventually, Goloszewski told Brandon he could go home. And once he was gone, the detective just sat by himself in the interview room, thinking over his entire suspect list. He had already ruled out Carrie's estranged husband pretty much as soon as he had run his name through the system, because what he found is he was in the military and living 250 miles away on a base in New York. And Michelle's husband, Brandon, didn't seem very promising either, since he appeared to be basically clueless about his wife's romantic dynamic. However, Carrie and Michelle, on the other hand, seemed like real possibilities. So, Goloszewski wrote out 2 applications for search warrants, one for the apartment Carrie shared with Devin, and one for the home where Michelle lived with Brandon. Goloszewski was pretty sure Devin had not been killed where her body was found, and he figured with one of these searches, he'd find the real murder scene. So far, the investigation had been moving extremely fast, and to Goloszewski's delight, he was able to get both warrants granted right away. So the momentum continued. Late on the same night that Devin's body had been found, 2 teams of crime scene technicians descended on the 2 properties and began searching for evidence. Goloszewski went first to the home where Devin had lived with Carrie. And the first thing he noticed was the place was in shambles. Furniture was overturned and strewn about like a very intense fight had taken place there. In the bathroom, a few members of the forensics team had found what appeared to be a car's floor mat in the shower, just like the floor mat that was missing from Devin's car. And so the running theory became amongst the people on the scene that the mat was there because clearly it was being washed, and probably recently. And so Goloszewski watched as someone from forensics sprayed the shower floor beneath the mat with luminol, a chemical compound used by law enforcement to detect blood. And immediately, the area that was sprayed began to glow blue, suggesting that there was indeed the presence of blood either on that floor mat or in the shower. Now, the luminol test was not 100% accurate, but at this point, for Goloszewski, it was good enough. And so as he stood there looking at the glowing bathroom floor, he realized he might very well be standing in the home of his killer. By the time Goloszewski made it over to Michelle and Brandon's house to check on how the search was going over there, it was past midnight, so he was tired, but he was also feeling pretty good about the state of his case. And initially, when a crime scene tech began walking him through Michelle and Brandon's home, he felt even better. because there was no blood at all inside of Michelle and Brandon's house. There was no sign of a fight either. But then, the crime scene tech told Goloszewski that they had found some blood with the luminol test out in the backyard, on a pool cover and on the nozzle of a hose. Goloszewski frowned. Until this moment, he had felt lucky to have found blood in one suspect's home. Now he had blood in both the homes where all his suspects lived, making this thing even more confusing. Now, he was fairly certain that Carrie, Michelle, and Brandon had not all worked together to kill Devin, and even if they had, they wouldn't result in two separate murder scenes miles apart. Goloszewski checked his watch, and he saw that at this point, he'd been awake for almost 24 hours. And so he decided to let the crime scene unit finish processing both homes and go get some sleep. He'd come back fresh in the morning, and hopefully then, things would look clearer. When Goloszewski walked into his office the next day on June 16th, so one full day after Devin Guzman's body had been found, he found her autopsy report waiting for him on his desk, and it was gruesome. The wound to Devin's throat was a 4-inch-long cut that went almost all the way to her spine. The cut had severed her tongue and also sliced in half both her right carotid artery and also her right jugular vein. When the coroner originally pulled her body from the car, they thought for a moment that her head had actually been completely cut off. Devin had lost almost all the blood in her body before she was placed in the car. So Goloszewski had been right, that she had been killed somewhere else, like Carrie's shower or maybe Michelle's backyard. But as he continued reading, he realized he had been wrong about something else. The coroner had put Devin's time of death somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. Until this moment, Goloszewski still thought that Carrie was his best suspect. But now he thought of something. Carrie didn't have a car. To kill Devin and leave her at Canal Park, Carrie would have had to walk 8 miles back to her apartment, which would have taken at least 3 hours. And so obviously she had not done that because she had been at home when Michelle showed up looking for Devin at 2:30 a.m. And so suddenly, Michelle was looking a lot better as Goloszewski's killer. And that's when Goloszewski's desk phone rang. An officer on the other line told the detective that he had the strange caller on hold, and that this guy was saying really weird stuff about the Devin Guzman case. The officer said he would patch him through. Goloszewski dropped the stack of papers on his desk and picked up a pen just in time to hear the voice of a man who introduced himself as George Vine Jr. The man said he was a friend of Devin and Michelle, and a few months ago, Michelle had offered him sex or money to, quote, get rid of Devin. Now, at the time, he said he just laughed it off because he knew how volatile Devin and Michelle's relationship could be, and he figured this was just more of that. But now that Devin was dead, he wasn't so sure. And now, neither was Goloszewski. And so Goloszewski now had a whole new theory for this case, with Michelle, not Carrie, at the center. But almost immediately, he started running into new problems. George Vine Jr.'s story sounded like a slam dunk. But when another detective went to take his statement, he found that it was actually months old and pretty vague, and that Vine had no corroborating evidence. And as Goloszewski and his team began the painstaking process of conducting interviews with every family member, friend, and neighbor of Devin's they could find, more cracks formed in the Michelle theory. 2 separate sets of interviews threw Goloszewski off. The first set was with Michelle and Brandon's neighbors. They told police that Michelle and Brandon fought with each other constantly, and that, contrary to what Brandon had told Goloszewski, he did know about Michelle and Devin's relationship, and he wasn't happy about it. And one of these 2 neighbors had actually heard Brandon arguing with Devin on the same night Devin was killed. And so this made Goloszewski think that he should be looking more closely at Brandon. However, the second set of interviews muddied the waters even further and pointed him right back at Carrie. Because her neighbors said that on the night of the murder, they heard fighting too. Now, Goloszewski already knew that Carrie and Devin had fought because Carrie herself had told him this, but Carrie had claimed that the last time she saw Devin was at about 12:15 a.m. when Devin left to head to Michelle's. Her neighbors, though, said differently. One woman said after hearing this fight, she had walked past their apartment at about 1:30 a.m., and she saw that the front door was open. And inside, she said that she could see this woman laying on a couch wearing a green jacket. This was obviously significant because when Devon's body was found, she was being covered by a green jacket. If what this woman said was true, it meant Carrie lied about when Devon left her apartment. The final complicating piece of evidence arrived late that afternoon. The crime scene techs had tested the blood found at both Carrie and Devon's apartment and Michelle and Brandon's apartment. The blood that was found in Michelle and Brandon's yard couldn't be matched to anyone because it was too diluted. But the blood in Carrie's shower was a match for Devon. Less than 1 week into his murder case, Goloszewski now had 3 suspects. They all had motive and opportunity. And they had all lied to him. And Goloszewski had witness statements and physical evidence that made all of them look guilty. But Goloszewski knew they didn't all murder Devon, and he was stumped as to how to figure out which one did. Devon's funeral was held on June 21st, 6 days after her murder. 400 people attended her funeral. And right around that day, Goloszewski and his team sat down with all their files and went back to square one. They went through every interview, every piece of physical evidence, every observation that any of them had made during their investigation so far, and as they did this, they ended up stumbling upon this sort of unusual plan that they believed would point them to their killer. On June 28th, about a week and a half after Devon Guzman was killed, Detective Goloszewski sat in an unmarked police car parked on the side of a street. It was a Wednesday, which was important, because Wednesday was trash day, and Goloszewski was waiting for one of his suspects to leave their home and bring their trash to the curb, because their trash was not just trash. In Goloszewski's eyes, it was evidence. And in the state of Pennsylvania, once someone puts their trash out on the curb for collection, the trash is no longer considered private, and so the cops don't need a search warrant to go sifting through it. This kind of curbside search is called a trash pull. So now, Goloszewski was betting on bags of trash to close this case. Eventually, his suspect emerged carrying their trash, they put it on the side of the road, and Goloszewski waited until they were back inside their home. Then he climbed out of his car, grabbed the trash, put it in his trunk, and drove to the police station. Once inside headquarters, Goloszewski brought the trash bags into an evidence room, ripped them open, and dumped their contents out on a table. And then he began the very dirty work of sorting through all the smelly junk, the rotting food, the discarded receipts, the coffee grinds, the wet paper towels, and balled-up clumps of newspaper. But then, right as he reached the end of the bag, he found something. This discovery would trigger the police to exhume Devon's body and look inside of her mouth. And once they did this, they had their killer. Based on evidence collected by the Easton Police Department over the course of a nearly 2-month investigation, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Devon Guzman in the early hours of June 15, 2000. Devon Guzman had actually left her killer's home, but she eventually came back. And when the killer saw her, all the rage they'd been feeling for weeks exploded, and the killer lunged at Devon. But Devon fought back, and for a brief moment, Devon escaped their killer and began to walk away, but the killer took the moment that Devon's back was turned to come up behind her with a knife, and they reached around and they viciously slit her throat. Then, after Devon had bled to death, the killer dragged Devon's body to Devon's own car. She put her body in the back seat, along with a decoy knife in her hand, and then the killer drove the car all the way to Canal Park and left it there. Now, the killer might have gotten away with it, except for the bite mark. They didn't even realize Devon had left during the fight. And the reason they didn't realize it is because Devon did not bite the killer. She bit the killer's accomplice. And the accomplice, not really realizing how significant that bite mark was, had just dressed the wound as if it was just any other wound. They'd put gauze and bandages over the bite mark. And unfortunately for them, but fortunately for law enforcement, those bandages, when they were discarded in their trash, well, police were able to actually see the bite mark on the bandage. It retained the bite mark and gave away that's what it had been dressed over. Now, Goloszewski might have noticed the bite mark on the accomplice's arm when he interviewed them, except the accomplice was wearing long sleeves in the middle of the summer. The killer was Michelle, and her accomplice was her husband, Brandon. The blood identified in Carrie's bathroom was indeed Devon's, but it had not come from her murder. She had simply bled in the shower, naturally, just close to the time that she was killed. The car mat turned out to not have any blood on it at all. Instead, it was stained with pickled beet juice, which Devin or Carrie had coincidentally tried to wash off in the shower. Devin's body was covered in dirt and grass stains because she was likely killed outside, in the backyard of Michelle and Brandon's home. As for the eyewitness who saw Devin on the couch at Carrie's house on the night of the murder, they were simply mistaken about the time. Both Michelle and Brandon were arrested in August of 2000. They each blamed the other for the actual killing, although prosecutors presented evidence that suggests Michelle had been wielding the knife. On October 5, 2001, both Michelle and Brandon were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They later divorced. As for Carrie, she was completely exonerated and actually wound up reuniting with her estranged husband. A 28-year-old Russian man named Artyom Sidorkin started having severe chest pains, and at first he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and then he began coughing up blood, and so finally he went to the emergency room. When he got there, even before the doctors examined him or gave him an x-ray, just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day, they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him and hearing about all of his symptoms and just looking at him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that, yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. And so before they went to just start removing huge pieces of his lung, they told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it to see if it's cancerous or not. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay, he schedules his surgery, he goes in a couple days later, and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there is something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. After the discovery of what was inside of his lung, a spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked and he said, "I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me." But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. There is a picture of this tree inside of his lung tissue, but it's a bit graphic, so if you want to see it, go ahead and Google tree and lung, and I'm sure you'll find it. Our next story is called Midnight Stroll. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach, and so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, but since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named André Monet who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out, and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert. And as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with, and so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds. He was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. The next and final story of today's episode is called Trauma Room 1. On the night of February 19th, 1994, a man in Southern California called 911 because his girlfriend was struggling to breathe. When the 911 dispatcher picked up this man's call, he was very distraught and asked them to please send an ambulance as fast as you possibly can. But despite how upset this man was on the phone, he was not actually surprised this situation was unfolding. His girlfriend, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez, had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer just 6 weeks earlier, and the doctors had told her that she likely did not have much time left. And, making this even more tragic, Gloria had actually gone into the hospital a few years earlier with symptoms and signs that she likely had cancer, but the doctors missed it. Had they caught it back then, they likely could have saved her. Still, after receiving her very grim diagnosis just a few weeks earlier, Gloria had resolved to fight her cancer as best as she could. After all, she had a lot to lose. Gloria had 2 young kids. She had a boy and a girl who were 9 and 12 years old respectively. And Gloria absolutely adored them and really devoted her life to them. In the evenings, she would play with them and help them with their homework, and the whole time she'd be cracking jokes to make them laugh and smile. And then even when Gloria was not actively parenting her kids, she was always a very positive presence in their lives. She was optimistic, she was happy, she was upbeat, and oftentimes she could be found wandering around with a big smile on her face, singing a religious hymn to herself. So, when Gloria got this terrible news that she had late-stage cancer, she was obviously terrified and sad, but she was also very determined to find a way to survive because she knew her kids still needed her. Around the time Gloria was diagnosed, her doctors told her she would begin radiation treatment for her cancer at the end of February, so she had a few weeks to wait. And so during this waiting period, Gloria found herself spending a lot of time researching her disease, looking for things she could be doing on her own right now to make herself feel better or even potentially increase the odds of her survival. So on February 19th, when Gloria told her boyfriend that she was starting to have some issues breathing, the boyfriend didn't hesitate for a second to call 911 because he knew firsthand from living with Gloria that she was desperate to survive. And so any changes in her symptoms needed to be treated like an emergency. It was around 8 p.m. that night when the ambulance pulled up in front of Gloria's home. Paramedics climbed out, they rushed over to Gloria, they put her on a stretcher, they gave her a mask with oxygen, and then they loaded her into the back of the ambulance, and then seconds later, they were flying down the road with their sirens blaring. While they sped toward the hospital in Riverside, which is a city about an hour east of Los Angeles, one of the paramedics on board the ambulance called ahead to the Riverside Hospital emergency room to talk to one of the doctors. And the doctor who answered was a 33-year-old woman named Dr. Julie Gorchinsky. And she loved her job. She loved the thrill and excitement and challenge of working in a big city emergency room. And so she takes this call. The paramedics tell her that they have a patient who has terminal cancer. She's having a hard time breathing, and her heart rate is becoming very unstable to the point where if it's not controlled soon, it's going to kill her. And they told Julie they would be there in about 5 minutes. And so Julie, she hangs up the phone and immediately began preparing for receiving a critical patient, as well as getting trauma room 1 ready, which is where Gloria would be treated. Now, as bad as this situation was for Gloria, for Julie and the other nurses and doctors in this emergency room, this was kind of business as usual. They were used to receiving patients that were in very rough shape. And so as Julie and the rest of her medical team waited for this ambulance to arrive, none of them were worried that they wouldn't be able to handle this patient. They thought tonight was going to be as routine as any other night. However, they would be very, very wrong. The ambulance ride took about 15 minutes, so they pulled into the Riverside Hospital right at 8:15 p.m. And as soon as the ambulance came to a stop, the paramedics jumped out, they ran around to the back, they opened up the back doors, they pulled Gloria out still on her stretcher, and they pushed her as fast as they could through the doors into the emergency room. Once inside, Julie and the rest of her team, they took Gloria and they pushed her left down a hallway into trauma room 1. Once inside, the doctors and nurses immediately noticed that Gloria's heart rate was spiking dramatically and her blood pressure was falling dramatically. So Julie and her team began administering a standard set of treatments for someone in this condition. They switched Gloria's oxygen mask she had been using on the ambulance ride for a more powerful one. They gave her painkillers, sedatives, and drugs to help steady her heartbeat. And at first, the treatments seemed to be working because pretty quickly Gloria's heartbeat began to level out. However, it didn't last. Soon, Gloria's heartbeat was racing so insanely fast that all of these alarms were going off on her heartbeat monitor. Knowing they had to act quickly, Julie and her team began removing Gloria's t-shirt in order to administer electric shocks to her chest with paddles. This is a way for doctors to kind of reset a patient's heartbeat. As the nurses got the electric paddles ready, they and the rest of the medical team suddenly noticed 2 strange things about Gloria. The first was that Gloria seemed to be emitting this strange garlicky smell from her mouth. The second was Gloria's skin looked very greasy. However, despite the entire medical team taking note of these 2 things, no one thought they were significant. Lots of patients suddenly are brought into the ER, and very rarely do they have a chance to shower or brush their teeth beforehand. And so they figured that was the reason she looked and smelled that way. Finally, the big electrical paddles were ready, and so the nurses placed them on either side of Gloria's heart, and then they began sending powerful bolts of electricity into Gloria's chest. While the nurses worked on Gloria's heart, other members of the medical team needed to assess Gloria's overall condition. And so to do that, they needed to draw her blood. So a nurse took an alcohol wipe and cleaned a small spot on Gloria's arm, and then she took a syringe and jabbed it inside of Gloria and began the draw. And as soon as she did this, trauma room 1 filled with a new smell. It was a chemical smell. And Julie immediately noticed it, and she looked over at the nurse doing the blood draw, and she said, "I think it smells like ammonia in here." And the nurse, who was doing the blood draw, kind of scrunched her face up in disgust and nodded in agreement. The nurse finished the blood draw and then handed the blood vial to Julie. And as Julie was taking this blood vial from the nurse, she noticed the nurse looked suddenly very confused and very disoriented. Her eyes were kind of flickering and she was staring straight ahead like she didn't know where she was. And so Julie, she sees this in the nurse, and then she glances down at this blood vial in her own hand now, and she sees something she's never seen before. The blood inside this vial, Gloria's blood, was full of these small white crystals. But before Julie could tell anybody else in the room about these strange crystals in the patient's blood, the nurse who had done the blood draw went from being dazed and confused to collapsing on the ground. Luckily, another doctor had seen the nurse starting to collapse and dove out and caught her right before her head hit the ground. This collapsed nurse was very quickly placed on a stretcher and wheeled out of Trauma Room 1 so the other doctors and nurses could focus on Gloria, who was obviously dying. And so Julie, who was still just standing in the middle of this room holding this vial of blood, was wondering what the heck just happened to her colleague, and she's also looking down at these crystals thinking, I've never seen this before, what does this mean? And right as she was about to flag one of the other medical team members over to look at it, Julie began feeling very nauseous and her head started spinning, and then she felt like she might collapse. And so not wanting to cause any more distractions for the main team, she quickly placed this vial of blood on a nearby tray, and then she quickly made her way out of Trauma Room 1 and sat down in a nearby chair. And as soon as she sat down, another staff member at the hospital who had not been inside of the trauma room ran over to Julie and asked her, hey, are you okay? And Julie, she looked up at the staff member and she tried to speak, but she couldn't. And then her eyes rolled back into her skull and she slumped forward and fell to the ground. And at the same moment that Julie was collapsing outside of Trauma Room 1, inside of the trauma room, there was another thud as another nurse collapsed, and then another, and then another. And before long, screams were coming out of Trauma Room 1 as people inside who had not collapsed yet are looking around, seeing their colleagues just dropping like flies for no reason. And so pretty quickly, the call came out over the hospital intercom to evacuate the hospital. The only people that would stay back would be a skeleton crew of doctors and nurses and Gloria, because they felt like moving Gloria outside right now would likely kill her. We need to save her right now. Outside the hospital, the parking lot very quickly filled up with doctors and nurses and other sick people on stretchers. People were screaming and crying, sirens were blaring, and the medical staff that was still healthy was running all over the place looking for supplies to help treat their coworkers. Meanwhile, back inside of Trauma Room 1, things for Gloria only seemed to be getting worse. The 4 doctors and nurses who had stayed back continued to administer more drugs, more shocks to her chest, more oxygen, but no matter what they did, her blood pressure continued to fall, and her heartbeat became fainter and fainter and fainter. Finally, at 8:50 p.m., roughly 35 minutes after Gloria had first been wheeled into the emergency room, she died. In that 35-minute window, 23 of Riverside Hospital staff had either collapsed or become very sick and then collapsed, and many of them had to be hospitalized. But the most affected person by far was Julie. She was in such bad shape by the time she made it out to the parking lot that she was actually put on an ambulance from her hospital and driven to another hospital where she was admitted to their intensive care unit. And there, a nurse drew her blood, and in it were little white crystals, just like in Gloria's blood. At 11 p.m. on the same night all this craziness happened, a hazardous materials team dressed in full hazmat suits entered the Riverside Hospital to look for a chemical leak, because that was the running theory that some sort of leak had happened in the hospital, it had made its way into Trauma Room 1, and that's what had caused everyone to collapse and get sick. But despite an extensive search, the hazmat team did not find any leaks. Stumped, authorities decided to just be extra careful around this hospital and around Gloria's body until they figured out what had happened, because the fear was there was some sort of unknown or hidden toxin either in this building or on or in Gloria's body. 6 days after the incident, inside of a special airtight room, while wearing full-body protective suits, doctors performed an autopsy on Gloria. And they discovered there was absolutely nothing toxic inside of her. In fact, the autopsy only revealed that Gloria had died of natural causes. Her cancer had caused her heart and her kidneys to fail. Meanwhile, although the other medical staff members who had gotten sick inside of Trauma Room 1 had mostly recovered, Julie just could not seem to get any better. She had breathing problems and pancreatitis, which is the inflammation of the pancreas, and it's very painful. And her bones were literally just starting to die, leaving her in a wheelchair. Gloria's family blamed Riverside Hospital for Gloria's death, insisting that these toxic fumes that must have been present inside of Trauma Room 1 came from the hospital, and those fumes are responsible for what happened to the staff, and they are responsible for killing Gloria. And in fact, 3 times in the 3 years leading up to Gloria's death, Riverside Hospital had had some issues with hazardous materials making their way into the hospital. There was sewer gas that came in from a drain. There was a toxic gas that was created from a sterilizer that made 2 people in the hospital sick, and some of the hospital's water was found to have algae in it. But the hospital said they checked their hospital, there was no leak, we did not cause whatever toxic fumes were inside of Trauma Room 1, and so we are not responsible for what happened to our staff or what happened to Gloria. Riverside Hospital would be searched again and again for some sort of leak. Also, Gloria's home would be searched for toxic gases, and Gloria would be autopsied 2 additional times. But no one could find anything toxic anywhere. So, eventually, California's Department of Human and Health Services came forward and said they had the answer to what had happened inside of Trauma Room 1. They said it was mass sociogenic illness. Mass sociogenic illness is when a group of people all believe they have the same illness, even though there's nothing wrong with any of them. It's caused by fear and anxiety. Basically, the state of California was saying that Julie and the other 22 staff members who had gotten sick and collapsed had just pretended they were making it up. As for Gloria, they said she just died from her cancer. Now, of course, this explanation made a lot of people unhappy, like Gloria's family, and of course Julie, whose medical problems were very well documented. She couldn't walk anymore because her bones were literally dying. And so, Gloria's family and Julie said, you know what, we think the hospital is covering something up, and we are going to sue. But before they did, an obscure lab located just outside of San Francisco, California, it was called the Forensic Science Center, was called in to do yet another investigation into what happened inside of Riverside Hospital. And what these scientists found would make history. Here is what they discovered. After Gloria was diagnosed with cancer, she began researching not only her disease, but also alternative treatments that she could do on her own before she began her radiation treatment at the end of February. And according to the scientists of Forensic Science Center, Gloria must have begun using a well-known controversial home remedy to help with her pain. It was called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO for short. In the 1960s, DMSO was prescribed to treat pain and anxiety, but as it became more popular, it was discovered that it could cause eye damage, and so the government said, you can't use this anymore. But even though DMSO was no longer available as a medicine, it was still being sold in gel form inside of hardware stores as a heavy-duty degreaser. And it was this type of DMSO, the gel form, that Gloria had begun rubbing all over her skin, head to toe. This was the reason when she arrived in the emergency room, her skin looked greasy because she was literally covered head to toe in this gel. It was also why her breath smelled like garlic, because after DMSO is absorbed into your bloodstream, you emit a sort of garlicky smell both through your pores and out of your mouth. But the discovery that Gloria had been using DMSO did not account for why all these people in the hospital began collapsing and falling ill when they were around her. It turned out on the night that Gloria's boyfriend called 911 because Gloria was suffering from breathing problems, Gloria was also suffering from another medical issue, but it was so minor, the boyfriend didn't think to bring it up to the 911 dispatcher or to the paramedics when they arrived. And this secret medical condition that Gloria had was a urinary tract infection, which is an infection in any part of the urinary system. These are very common and usually very easy to treat. But what nobody realized was that because Gloria had this infection, her body was not flushing out the DMSO chemicals that had seeped inside of it from all this gel on her skin. Still, even very large amounts of DMSO chemicals inside of your body or on your skin is not enough to cause any harm to you or people around you. The danger started when the EMTs in the ambulance put that oxygen mask on Gloria's face as they transported her to the hospital. Suddenly, there was this new chemical being introduced into Gloria's body, oxygen. And the scientists from the Forensic Science Center said this new chemical, oxygen, began interacting with the DMSO chemicals trapped inside of Gloria's body, and together they formed a new chemical. Now, if Gloria had gotten to the hospital and responded more positively to the treatments and medicines that the doctors and nurses at the ER gave her, then Julie and the rest of the staff inside of that hospital would never have gotten sick. For that to happen, for that catastrophe to play out inside of that hospital, two very specific things had to happen in the correct order. And they did. First, there was the electric shocks. When the medical team was pumping electrical shocks into Gloria's chest, the scientists from the Forensic Science Center say those charges of electricity interacted with that new chemical that had been created inside of Gloria, and it changed this new chemical again. And this time, the change made the chemical deadly. It became what's known as dimethyl sulfate, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I. Once Gloria received those shocks to her chest, her body basically became a canister of nerve gas. And then one of the nurses drew Gloria's blood, which was the second event that ultimately set off the catastrophe. Emergency rooms are typically kept fairly cold, roughly 66 degrees Fahrenheit. But when this new deadly chemical was created inside of Gloria, it was still inside of her body where it was warm. And for dimethyl sulfate, when it is warm, it's unstable and much less dangerous. But when that nurse drew Gloria's blood, inside of the blood was the deadly chemical, and now it was no longer in Gloria, it was in this cool 66-degree room, and so it began to stabilize and started producing those little white crystals inside of the blood vial that Julie saw, and as it stabilized, it turned into a gas, and it filled the room, and the staff began to breathe it in. The scientists from the Forensic Science Center do not think that this mass poisoning event contributed to Gloria's death, meaning Gloria did really die from her cancer. Gloria's family has denied that Gloria ever used DMSO, and they still insist that the hospital was responsible for Gloria's death. The hospital would ultimately pay $800,000 in settlement money to Gloria's family, but the hospital would never admit that they did anything wrong. Julie's lawsuit against the hospital was ultimately dismissed, and her bones never really recovered from the damage that was done to them, despite 8 surgeries to try to fix them. However, Julie would eventually go back to being a practicing doctor at another hospital, and she has said the ordeal she went through inside of Trauma Room 1 at Riverside Hospital actually made her a better doctor.
All the walls are breathing slowly. Cracks like rivers trace the night. Shadows fold around the memory of a love that wouldn't die. I hear your name inside the static, a ghost that moves beneath the glass.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.